Up until now, all of the melodies that we have looked at are what are called monophonic, which means that we're only playing one note at the same time. But obviously, in addition to monophonic melodies, you can also have polyphonic melodies. And this is part music theory course, part Latin right now. But poly means many, so this is when you're playing multiple notes at the same time. And we call this a chord in music. Now, if we look at a scale, let's say C major, for example. And C major has C, D, E, F, G, A, B. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, basically any combination of these 7 notes that you can possibly think of has a very specific name in music. They've been playing music for, thousands of years, and everything has been named at this point. So there's a lot of different combinations of notes you can play, and there's different names for the chords, but there's some that are really common. So I'm just going to highlight those in this video. First and foremost, even though there's a specific name for every combination of notes within a scale, there kind of is a default answer with chords. So if someone says, hey, can you play me a C chord? What they're normally referring to is the 1, 3, and 5 of the scale played together. So in the case of C major, this would be C, E, and G. And if someone says, can you just play a C chord? This is what they're referring to. Specifically, this is called a triad, which is the 1, 3, 5 of the scale. And even more specifically, we would call this a major triad because it's the 1, 3, 5 of the major scale. If we bring in C minor, just to take a look at it, it's C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The triad for the minor scale would be the 1, 3, 5 of the minor scale, which would look like C, E flat, G. And when you look at a major triad versus a minor triad, the difference is always that the 3 of the scale, which is the second note in the triad, is one step down, aka it's flattened in the minor triad. So that's going to be a really important concept, that the only thing that's different between a C major chord and a C minor chord is this flattened third. In fact, we could actually parse out this interval right here. So if we thought about what the actual interval was in the major scale, it would go C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E. So this would be 5 notes. And in the minor scale, it would be C, C sharp, D, right to E flat. So this is 4 notes. So this interval from C to the 3 of the scale in the major scale is called a major third interval. And the minor third is called the minor third interval. And this is going to be really important just to know these intervals as a named kind of entity. Something else that's interesting when you play a major triad, people will say that the emotion attached to it is that it sounds happy. And when you play a minor triad, the emotion attached to it sounds sad. And you can play with this yourself and kind of experiment, but it is kind of true that major chords tend to sound happier than minor chords. And it'll probably take you your whole life if you want to try and figure out why that is, but it's an interesting question to think about. I'm going to bring a piano keyboard into the mix now. And if we wanted to play a C chord on a piano, we could play the C note here, the E note here, the G note here, and that would be a C chord. Well, in addition to playing all the notes in the chord, we could also play additional notes that are in that chord in some order. So if I wanted to play an extra bass note on C, I could play that with my left hand, and this is still a C chord. It's not saying that we have to play each of these notes once. It's just saying that these are the only notes that are being played. I could also play a G up an octave here, and this is still a C chord. I could even reverse the order of the C and the G, for example. So I could play the G here and the E here, and this is still a C chord. These different variants of the exact same chord are what are called voicings. And these are going to be extremely important because when you look up music, a lot of the times it says that, okay, well, there's a C chord being played here, but the actual specific voicing of the chord that you want to use is often up to the musician. And that's what distinguishes different musicians from each other, is what voicings of chords they use. You can see these different voicings on a guitar too. So for example, if I wanted to play the default C major chord, it would look like C3, E3, G3, C4, and then E4 played together. But you could also play a C major chord like this, where you play C3, G3, C4, E4, G4, and then C5 as the highest note. So these, even though these are both C chords, they sound slightly different because they have different voicings to them. But if you look at the way that I have been looking at these voicings so far, there's one thing that's always in common, which is that the C is always the bass note. So that means the 1 of the scale is always being played as the lowest frequency note in the voicing of the chord. Well, that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. So if I didn't play a C here and I instead played an E, well, now this is a slightly different chord because the lowest frequency is not the 1 of the chord. The lowest frequency is the 3 of the chord. When you're playing the piano, you'll call this an inversion. So this would actually be a first inversion of the C chord because the second note is what's the bass note, and you could also, if you played the G as the lowest frequency, this would be a second inversion of the chord. In guitar, you would call a chord like this a slash chord, so the term would be slash chord, and this means a chord that you're playing over a bass note. So you might see something like C/G being written, which means you're playing a C chord, which means you're only playing the note C, E, G, but G is the lowest frequency note that you're being played. But normally, it's going to be most common to see the 1 of the chord as the lowest frequency. So the next chord to note would be a 7 chord. And the 7 chord is going to look very similar to the major triad, which is the 1, 3, 5 of the scale, but it's also going to add the 7. So instead of just playing C, E, and G, we would also play the 7, so B. And then obviously we could play some different voicings like this. So a chord like this would still be a 7 chord, and you'd write it like this, so like C7. And this is referring to that C major 7. And obviously if this E was an E flat instead, so instead of playing these E's right here, we were playing E flats right here, then this becomes a C minor 7 chord. And one thing to note on piano is when you're playing a 7 chord as opposed to the normal C major chord, you're always going to be playing additional notes. Like you'll always have to hold down an additional key on the piano to play that 7. The interesting thing to note, though, is when you're playing a 7 chord on a guitar, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're pressing down additional frets. For example, an E minor chord is played by holding these 2 frets and playing all the strings. But an E minor 7 chord is made by only holding down 1 fret. This is because you're releasing this 2nd fret from being an E into being a D, which is the 7 of the scale. So you're actually playing more notes by holding down less frets, which is kind of an interesting concept. Same thing, G sharp minor 7. And in much the same way that you can have 7 chords, you can also have what are called 6 chords. And that's when you take the 1, 3, 5, and 6 of the scale. So you can see that, and this would be called C6, and obviously if it was E flat, that would be C minor 6. And you can see the way that these chord names are being based off of that major triad. We're assuming that we're playing that triad, and then the 6 is just referring to an additional note that we're playing in the scale. So C, E, G, A, that is a C6 chord. Next up are intervals. So for example, you could play a 4th interval by just playing the 1 and 4 alone. So just playing the C and F together, this would be playing the 4th interval. You could also play a 1-3, which is a major 3rd interval, which would just be C and E together. But by far the most common interval that you're going to see played alone that's just 2 notes is the 5th interval. So that's when you play 1 and 5 together. This would be C and G in the case of C major. And the 5th interval is what is called a power chord. And again, the 5th is the same in the major or minor scale, so you don't need to specify major or minor, and you'll see this written a lot as just C5. So C5 would be the 1 and 5 of the C major scale. And power chords, the meme with power chords is that if you went to something like a high school battle of the bands, you would see a lot of power chords being played, because that's the sound you hear in a lot of kind of rock music, those like beginning riffs. Next up are suspended chords. I'm using D major now instead of C major, but if I were to make the normal D major triad, I would use D, F sharp, and A, which is the 1, 3, and 5 of the scale. Now, in order to make a suspended chord, I'm going to, instead of using the 3, I'm going to replace it with either the 2 or the 4. So for example, if I made the chord D, E, A, Runaway Libertarians, and this is the 1, 2, and 5 of the chord, this would be called a D suspended 2 chord, or written as D sus 2. And it's called suspended because you're actually removing the 3 and you're replacing it with a different note. Likewise, if I did D, G, A, which is the 1, 4, 5, this would be called a D suspended 4 chord. And the suspended chords are useful because they sound very similar to the major chord. They sound very similar to the D, F sharp, A, but they sound like with a slightly different flavor. And that can be really useful when you are playing a chord that has D major over and over and over again. You can just kind of accent it by replacing a couple of those D majors with a D sus2, for example. Just make the song flow a little bit better instead of sounding too stagnant. So for example, if I was playing a melody that was just D chords and sounded like this, it sounds a little stagnant because I'm just playing that D. So an interesting thing I could do would just be throw in the sus2 and sus4 into it. So it sounds like... And yeah, so like that part, instead of doing... It's going like... And that just gives it a little bit more flavor. All right, next up are 9, 11, and 13 chords. Now, we saw that we could label the scale through 1 through 7 by going C, D, E, F, G, A, B. But the scale is a kind of perpetual thing. It doesn't just stop at B. The next element would actually be a C, but this is now up 1 octave. So the octave of this C is 1 octave higher than this C, but the scale would keep going, right? So you'd have D, and then E, then F, G, A, B, over and over again up an octave. And we could label these 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, ... and keep going. So when we have something that's called a C add 9 chord, what this is saying is that we're going to play the normal C chord. So that's 1, 3, 5, which is C, E, G. But we're going to add the 9. So the 9 would actually be D into this mix also. So C, E, G, D is what's called a C add 9 chord. You might see this written as C9, but a C9 is referring to when you have the 7 plus the 9. So you'd have C, E, G, B, D would be a C9 versus a C add 9. Likewise, I'm hoping that you can figure out that a C add 11 chord would be 1, 3, 5, 11. So you would have C, E, G, and then 11, which is the F up an octave. So C, E, G, F would be a C add 11, and likewise a C11 is when you have the 7 in there too. So C, E, G, B, F is a C11, and you guess you could do the same thing with 13. C add 13 would be 1, 3, 5, 13. So C, E, G, A up an octave. Likewise for C13. So lastly, I want to talk about diminished and augmented chords. So we said that when we have a C major chord, it's the 1, 3, 5, that's C, E, G. And if we wanted to make a C minor, all that we need to do is flatten the 3 and make C, E flat, G. Well, in order to play a diminished chord, we're going to flatten the 5 also. So we would make C, E flat, G flat. And this would be called a C diminished chord. And diminished chords are going to be extremely important when we talk about the diatonic chord progressions in a couple videos. These are going to be extremely common. The opposite of a diminished chord is what's called an augmented chord. So that's when you take the major triad and you augment the 5. So you would have C, E, G sharp. So this augmented 5 is what's called an augmented chord. And these are going to be important also, but the diminished chord is really the thing that is going to be important. Again, you don't need to necessarily memorize all of these right now, but it is helpful to have general intuition about how to name different chords. And like I said, there's hundreds of different kinds of chords that you can play, but this is really the basics that you need to know to get started. Now, this is going to get really interesting as we start talking about mathematical ways to progress between different chords to create different emotions. And we're going to talk about that in the next video.